In the dense jungles of South Vietnam, during the spring of 1970, a group of Australian and New Zealand soldiers moved quietly through the shadows. They weren't looking for a major battle, nor were they equipped with the firepower of an American division. Their mission was simple: patrol, search, disrupt the Viet Cong in their hidden strongholds. What they didn't know was that they were about to stumble on something extraordinary, something no one expected. On April 8th, deep in Phuoc Tuy Province, a routine patrol of the ANZAC Battalion uncovered a well-hidden enemy base. At first glance, it looked like just another Viet Cong bunker system, the kind they had seen many times before. But inside lay a prize so valuable that it would be called the biggest intelligence coup of the entire Vietnam War. This was Operation Townsville. It wasn't a large-scale clash like Long Tan, nor a prolonged siege like Khe Sanh. Instead, it was a small, sharp encounter where a handful of soldiers turned the tide of intelligence warfare. In a single moment, they captured the enemy's codes, their cipher pads, and the keys to breaking open Viet Cong communications across southern Vietnam. This was the kind of victory that didn't make the evening headlines. But in the war rooms of Saigon and Washington, it was priceless. And before we dive in, 90% of viewers who watch these videos aren't subscribed. If you enjoy forgotten stories of the Vietnam War, make sure to hit like and subscribe. We're on a mission to reach 15,000 subscribers, and your support makes a huge difference. So now let's go back to 1970 and see how a small ANZAC patrol changed the course of the war. By 1970, the Vietnam War had already dragged on for more than a decade. The United States carried the heaviest burden, with 500,000 troops spread across South Vietnam. But America was not alone. Alongside them fought allies: South Korea, Thailand, the Philippines, and smaller but highly professional forces from Australia and New Zealand. Australia's involvement began with military advisors in 1962. By 1965, combat units were deployed, and the first Australian task force, 1ATF, was formed the following year. Their base was at Nui Yat in Phuoc Tuy Province, a coastal region east of Saigon. Phuoc Tuy was no random choice. Its geography, thick jungles, rubber plantations, and remote villages, made it a natural Viet Cong stronghold. Local guerrilla units, along with the well-trained D445 Battalion, operated from hidden bases here. For the Australians, it was the perfect place to apply their specialty: long-range patrols, ambushes, and counter-insurgency warfare. New Zealand joined the fight by sending artillery and infantry companies that integrated directly with Australian battalions. This gave birth to the ANZAC Battalions, mixed formations of Australians and New Zealanders that fought as one. The 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, 6 RAR, was one of these units. Its men had already carved their place in history at Long Tan in 1966, where they faced overwhelming Viet Cong forces and held their ground. By 1970, 6 RAR was back in Phuoc Tuy, working side by side with the Royal New Zealand Infantry Regiment. But the situation was changing. America was beginning its policy of Vietnamization, handing over more responsibility to South Vietnamese forces while planning to withdraw its own. Allies like Australia faced the same pressure. Every battalion knew its time was limited. For 6 RAR, Operation Townsville would be their final operation before going home. Nobody could have guessed that this last mission would deliver one of the most important intelligence victories of the entire war. By early 1970, the war in South Vietnam was shifting. Across the country, U.S. troop numbers were starting to fall as Washington pushed forward with its Vietnamization policy. The idea was simple: South Vietnamese forces would take over the fighting, while American and Allied units slowly pulled back. But on the ground, the war was anything but simple. In Phuoc Tuy Province, the Australians and New Zealanders of the 1st Australian Task Force knew the enemy well. The Viet Cong Provincial headquarters had operated there for years, hidden deep in the jungle. It was the brain that directed ambushes, coordinated supply lines, and spread propaganda among the villages. Despite years of patrolling, the headquarters itself had remained elusive, always one step ahead. For 6 RAR, time was running out. Their tour in Vietnam was nearly finished, and soon they would be rotated home. But before leaving, they were tasked with one more operation: a search and destroy mission in the northeast of Phuoc Tuy. The mission would be called Operation Townsville, after the Australian city. It wasn't planned as a grand offensive. The goal was steady, methodical pressure, patrol the jungle, disrupt the enemy, and, if possible, locate bases and supply caches. The responsibility fell heavily on the ANZAC Battalion, a combined force of Australians and New Zealanders. The spearhead would be V4 Company of the Royal New Zealand Infantry Regiment, soon joined by W3 Company for reinforcement. Together with 6 RAR, they would sweep through one of the most dangerous regions of the province. What they couldn't know was that this routine operation, just another patrol, just another sweep through the thick, unforgiving jungle, would lead them straight to the hidden heart of the enemy in Phước Tuy. And in a single firefight, everything would change. On the 23rd of March 1970, Operation Townsville began. The men of 6 RAR and their New Zealand brothers from V4 Company moved out from Nui Yat into the dense, unforgiving jungle northeast of Phước Tuy Province. Their mission was straightforward on paper: conduct long-range patrols, sweep the area for Viet Cong activity, and apply constant pressure on enemy forces. But this wasn't a war of grand maneuvers or massive armored columns. The Australians and New Zealanders fought differently than their American allies. Where U.S. divisions often launched large-scale search and destroy operations with thousands of troops, artillery, and helicopters, the ANZAC style was quieter, more deliberate. They specialized in small unit patrolling, squads and platoons moving silently through the jungle, spreading out, listening, and waiting for signs of the enemy. Instead of charging into villages with overwhelming force, they relied on stealth, patience, and ambush tactics. This made them particularly effective in Phước Tuy, where the Viet Cong thrived in hidden camps and supply routes. The terrain was their constant enemy. The northeast of Phước Tuy was thick with tangled jungle, steep slopes, and suffocating humidity. Every movement was slow, deliberate, and exhausting. Booby traps, punji stakes, and tripwires could be anywhere. Leeches clung to the soldier's skin, and the heat turned every march into an endurance test. Over the first days of the operation, patrols uncovered small camps, supply caches, and signs of recent enemy activity, but no major contact. The men pushed deeper into the green labyrinth, alert with every step. Their commanders knew this was Viet Cong territory. Somewhere out there, hidden in the jungle, was the enemy's provincial headquarters. The Australians and New Zealanders were about to find it, but only after weeks of tension, careful movement, and one sudden violent encounter that would change everything. For 2 weeks, the patrols of Operation Townsville pressed deeper into the northeast of Phước Tuy Province. The ANZAC soldiers moved cautiously, their eyes scanning for tripwires, their ears tuned to the faintest sound of movement. They found abandoned camps, hidden storage pits, and trails that spoke of Viet Cong supply lines. But the enemy itself stayed in the shadows, just out of reach. That changed on the 8th of April, 1970. On that morning, V4 Company of the Royal New Zealand Infantry Regiment was moving through dense jungle when scouts noticed fresh signs of enemy movement. Footprints, disturbed vegetation, the faint smell of smoke from a hidden cooking fire. The company spread out, rifles raised, hearts pounding. They were closing in. Suddenly, gunfire erupted. Viet Cong fighters concealed in bunkers opened fire at close range. The jungle exploded with the crack of rifles and the thunder of automatic fire. The New Zealanders returned fire, advancing cautiously under cover. Grenades arced into the bunkers, sending shock waves through the trees. The firefight was sharp and violent, but the ANZACs pressed forward with discipline. Within minutes, they had driven the enemy from their positions. When the shooting died down, the soldiers moved in to search the site. What they found stunned them. This wasn't just another bunker complex. They had stumbled onto the headquarters of the Viet Cong Ba Long Province Committee, the nerve center of enemy activity in Phước Tuy. Inside the bunkers were stacks of documents, radios, maps, and, most critically, coded signals books and one-time cipher pads. At first, the men didn't realize the full value of what they had captured. To them, it looked like piles of paperwork. But when intelligence officers later examined the haul, the truth became clear. They had broken into the enemy's communications heart. The Viet Cong had just suffered a devastating blow. The battle itself was small, barely a skirmish compared to the huge clashes elsewhere in Vietnam. But in that brief firefight, a handful of ANZAC soldiers had achieved what countless large-scale sweeps had failed to do. They had ripped open the secrecy of the Viet Cong command. When the shooting stopped on April 8th, the soldiers of V4 Company began sifting through the captured bunkers. At first, the haul looked like nothing more than paperwork and field gear, the kind of clutter found in many abandoned Viet Cong camps. But there was something different here. Stacked neatly in boxes and bags were operational files, signal logs, and, most importantly, the enemy's cryptographic tools. Among them were one-time cipher pads and code books used by the Viet Cong Provincial headquarters. These weren't just routine notes. They were the keys to the enemy's hidden language. For years, the Viet Cong had relied on encrypted radio transmissions to coordinate movements, supply lines, and attacks. Their one-time cipher pads were designed to be unbreakable, with each set used only once before being destroyed. Capturing them intact was almost unheard of. Yet here they were, seized from the very heart of the enemy's command structure. As the material was rushed back to Nui Jat and then to higher intelligence centers, the scale of the find became clear. Analysts quickly realized that they could read Viet Cong communications in real time. Suddenly, Allied forces could anticipate movements, intercept supply runs, and disrupt planned offensives before they even began. General Creighton Abrams, the commander of all U.S. forces in Vietnam, was stunned by the magnitude of the breakthrough. He described it as the biggest intelligence coup of the entire war. Coming from a man who had overseen countless operations across the country, that praise carried enormous weight. The documents also revealed the structure of the Viet Cong network in Phước Tuy Province. They outlined chains of command, village contacts, and the links between local guerrillas and main force units, like the D445 Battalion. For the Australians and New Zealanders, who had been battling these shadowy enemies for years, the find was like pulling back a curtain. The hidden enemy was now exposed. The intelligence windfall had immediate effects. Allied patrols began ambushing Viet Cong units with uncanny timing. Supply caches were discovered and destroyed. Planned enemy attacks were blunted before they could even start. The Viet Cong in Phước Tuy found themselves hunted in ways they had never experienced before. All of this came from a single firefight, fought by a single company in the middle of the jungle on an otherwise unremarkable April day. Operation Townsville had just rewritten the intelligence game in South Vietnam. The discovery made during Operation Townsville was more than just a lucky break. It had immediate and far-reaching consequences for the war in Phước Tuy Province and beyond. In the short term, the captured codes and cipher pads allowed Allied intelligence teams to listen in on enemy plans. Patrols from the 1st Australian Task Force suddenly had the upper hand. They could anticipate Viet Cong resupply missions, intercept couriers, and prepare ambushes along jungle tracks that, until then, had been invisible. For the Viet Cong, it was a nightmare. The province headquarters had been the brain of their operations, directing D445 Battalion, guiding guerrilla cells, and keeping pressure on villages. Now, with their communications compromised, their ability to coordinate was shattered. Small victories soon followed. Australian and New Zealand patrols dismantled supply dumps, disrupted recruiting efforts, and forced the enemy further into hiding. At a wider level, the intelligence was shared with U.S. forces across Third Corps, the military zone that stretched from Saigon eastward into the provinces. The material offered insights into enemy networks, supply chains, and political structures that had long frustrated American commanders. For once, they had a clear window into how the Viet Cong thought and operated. Perhaps most importantly, Operation Townsville proved the value of the ANZAC approach. While American divisions often relied on massive sweeps, helicopters, and overwhelming firepower, the Australians and New Zealanders showed how methodical patrolling and persistence could yield results just as decisive and sometimes far more valuable. In the end, the intelligence coup was not a dramatic battlefield victory. There were no soaring casualty figures, no captured cities, no destroyed regiments. Instead, it was a victory of patience, stealth, and discipline. A small band of ANZAC soldiers had outsmarted the enemy and delivered a blow that reshaped the intelligence war in Vietnam. By late April 1970, Operation Townsville came to an end. The sweep through the northeast of Phước Tuy had delivered more than anyone could have expected. The bunkers were cleared, supply lines disrupted, and the intelligence hall was already shaping operations far beyond the province. But for the men of the 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, the operation carried an even deeper meaning. It was their last mission in Vietnam. After years of service, countless patrols and battles that had etched their names into military history, 6 RAR was preparing to go home. In May 1970, the battalion was officially withdrawn and replaced by 2 RAR, continuing the rotation of Australian battalions in Phước Tuy. For the soldiers, it was a moment of pride and reflection. They had arrived in Vietnam as part of a larger war effort, and they left knowing that their final operation had delivered a blow that commanders at the highest level called one of the war's greatest intelligence triumphs. The men who had once faced overwhelming odds at Long Tan in 1966 now ended their Vietnam service not with another massive battle, but with a quiet, calculated success: the capture of the enemy's secrets. It was a fitting farewell for a unit that had become known for discipline, resilience, and professionalism in one of the most unforgiving wars of the 20th century. Operation Townsville was not an isolated story. It was one chapter in a much larger record of service by the Australian and New Zealand forces in Vietnam. From the earliest days of the war, both nations committed themselves to supporting South Vietnam and their American allies. For Australia, this began with small numbers of advisors in 1962, but by 1966, it had grown into a full combat deployment. The creation of the 1st Australian Task Force, 1ATF, at Nui Yat, gave Canberra an independent command responsible for securing the whole of Phước Tuy Province. New Zealand's role was smaller in numbers, but equally significant in spirit. Instead of deploying large formations, Wellington sent artillery batteries and infantry companies. These companies were paired directly with Australian battalions, forming the ANZAC battalions. The partnership ran deep. Australians and New Zealanders trained, patrolled, and fought side by side as a single force. Together, the ANZACs developed a reputation for professionalism and effectiveness. Their methodical patrolling style, patience in the field, and skill at counter-insurgency made them well-suited for Phước Tuy's demanding terrain. Major operations like Long Tan, Breby, Coral Balmoral, and finally Townsville highlighted the crucial role they played. While their numbers were small compared to the Americans, their impact was outsized. For many U.S. commanders, the ANZACs became a model of how to fight the Viet Cong on their own terms. And with Operation Townsville, the partnership delivered not just another tactical win, but a breakthrough that shifted the entire intelligence war. In the vast history of the Vietnam War, Operation Townsville is not a household name. It doesn't appear in the same breath as Tet, Hue, or Khe Sanh. Yet for those who fought in Phước Tuy Province, and for those who studied the intelligence war, it stands out as one of the most decisive small unit victories of the entire conflict. The firefight on April 8th was short, sharp, and easily overshadowed by larger battles raging elsewhere in Vietnam. But the impact of what was captured that day cannot be overstated. The seizure of Viet Cong's cipher pads and codes gave Allied forces a rare and fleeting glimpse directly into the enemy's communications. For weeks, they could anticipate attacks, uncover supply networks, and neutralize plans before they materialized. For the Australians and New Zealanders, Operation Townsville became a powerful reminder of what discipline, patience, and persistence could achieve. It validated their approach to the war: long patrols, quiet ambushes, steady pressure, rather than relying solely on overwhelming firepower. The operation also marked a symbolic close to 6 RAR's Vietnam service. From the bloody clash at Long Tan in 1966 to the quiet but decisive success at Townsville in 1970, the battalion's journey reflected the arc of Australia's involvement in Vietnam: courage in battle, endurance in the field, and professionalism to the very end. Today, Townsville is remembered by veterans and historians not as a grand battle, but as a turning point in the intelligence war. It showed that sometimes the most important victories weren't measured in body counts or territory gained, but in secrets uncovered. It was proof that even in the twilight of Australia's commitment to Vietnam, the ANZACs could still change the course of the fight. Operation Townsville wasn't a headline-grabbing battle. It didn't leave behind wrecked tanks or endless casualty lists. Instead, it was a victory won in silence, with discipline, patience, and one incredible stroke of luck that turned into the biggest intelligence coup of the Vietnam War. For the men of 6 RAR and their New Zealand comrades, it was the perfect final chapter in Vietnam. They had fought a hidden enemy, and in their last operation, they uncovered the enemy's deepest secrets. General Crichton Abrams himself admitted it. The ANZACs had achieved something extraordinary. And just like these forgotten victories deserve to be remembered, our channel has its own mission. We're aiming for 15,000 subscribers. Right now, more than 90% of viewers aren't subscribed. And with just one click, you can help us reach that goal. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more hidden chapters of the Vietnam War, hit like and subscribe. Your support helps us bring more of these untold stories to life, and it keeps this channel growing stronger every week. Thank you for watching, and thank you for being part of this mission. Together we'll hit 15,000.